Over a quiet, picturesque suburban neighborhood, its neat streets lined with perfectly manicured lawns, white picket fences, and identical houses with freshly painted exteriors. Everything seems to be in order, almost too perfect. There's a stillness in the air, a sense of complacency that fills every inch of the neighborhood, like a well-rehearsed routine. The hum of everyday life is just beginning. The sound of sprinklers spraying water on lawns, the distant chatter of children in the yard, the soft revving of car engines as people begin their daily commutes. The focus shifts to a particular house, Gerald's house. It's slightly older than the others, the white paint fading a bit under the harsh rays of the sun. The front porch lined with a few plants that have seen better days. Inside, we see Gerald, mid-50s, with a weathered face that tells the story of a life lived under the strain of hard work, disappointment, and loneliness. His clothes are simple, faded jeans and an old shirt. He sits at the kitchen table, staring out the window with a cup of black coffee in hand. His posture is stiff, as if something is weighing on him. It's clear from the way he watches the world outside that he's a man of habit, a man who doesn't like change. From his vantage point, Gerald surveys the world with a sharp, almost predatory gaze, assessing everything and everyone. He's been here the longest in this neighborhood, longer than most of the families that now surround him. Over the years, he's become protective of the familiar. His routines, the people he knows, the comfort of predictability. The sound of the newspaper hitting the driveway below breaks his trance for a moment, but it doesn't take long before his attention shifts to something new. A moving truck parked outside the house next door. The camera pans to reveal a black man, unloading boxes from the back of the truck. Gerald's eyes narrow as he watches the stranger with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. The new neighbor, Elijah, is tall and muscular, with a quiet confidence in the way he moves. His dark skin contrasts sharply with the pale walls of the neighborhood. There's something unsettling about him. Elijah is unaware of the eyes upon him. He's too busy settling into his new home, adjusting boxes, unpacking, looking around at the place he now owns. Gerald sits there for a moment longer, his mind turning over what he's seeing. Why is this man here? What is he doing in this neighborhood? Gerald has lived here his entire life. He's seen people come and go, but never like this. Never someone so different. The thought of it makes his fingers tighten around his coffee mug. There's something about this that doesn't sit well with him. In the distance, a couple of neighbors pass by, some offering a friendly wave, others eyeing the situation with a quiet unease. But there's one neighbor in particular, an older woman named Linda, who stops to speak with Elijah. Gerald watches closely as Linda greets him warmly, exchanging pleasantries. Gerald's grip on the coffee mug tightens once more. He feels the discomfort rise in his chest. His thoughts race, fueled by the kind of biases and assumptions he's never questioned. This man doesn't belong here, he tells himself. This isn't the neighborhood for people like him. Gerald doesn't speak these thoughts aloud, but they fester in the quiet corners of his mind, eating away at him. The camera shifts to Elijah's perspective, showing his view of the neighborhood. He's focused on his task, but the discomfort in the air is palpable. As he lifts a box and walks to the front door, he notices a few lingering glances from other residents. Some are quick to avert their eyes, others stare just a little too long, but no one approaches to introduce themselves. It's a familiar feeling, being an outsider in a place where everyone else seems to belong. Elijah moves about his day, carrying on with his tasks, but there's an underlying tension between the two worlds. Gerald, from behind his window, continues to watch him, his thoughts clouded with skepticism and unfounded judgments. The space between them, the house, the yard, the neighborhood, is more than just physical distance. It's a wall that Gerald has built over the years, one that he doesn't realize is about to be tested. As the afternoon sun sets, Gerald finally steps outside, feeling a sense of unease lingering in the air. He crosses the street, casually walking past his neighbors, exchanging brief pleasantries. But his attention is drawn back to Elijah's house. He's still outside, hauling boxes, moving furniture, clearly settling in. Gerald's thoughts shift. He's not sure why he feels this way. Maybe it's just the suddenness of it all, the newness, the intrusion of something unfamiliar into his comfortable world. Maybe it's the way Elijah carries himself, like he belongs here. It's a feeling that cuts through Gerald's pride, his long-standing sense of ownership over the neighborhood. And that's when it hits him. He doesn't like feeling threatened. This new man, this new presence, shakes the very foundation of what Gerald has come to believe is his space, his territory. Elijah finishes his work for the day and heads inside. The camera lingers on the house, casting a long shadow in the dimming light. Gerald stops at the edge of his driveway, watching the house next door, his expression a mixture of confusion, jealousy, and something darker. He doesn't yet realize that the story is about to shift. The tension between these two men, who don't know each other yet, is about to become something much deeper, something tied to the past, to memories that have been buried for years. Gerald in his living room, pacing back and forth. The low hum of his old ceiling fan mixes with the soft creak of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet. The house is quiet, save for the occasional crackling sound of the ice maker in the kitchen. Gerald stops momentarily and gazes at a family photograph on the wall, a picture of him, his late wife, and their daughter. His face softens for a brief second, but it's quickly replaced with an edge of frustration. There's a heaviness to his movements, a certain weariness in the way he drags his feet across the floor. This is not the confident man we saw earlier. This is someone caught in his own thoughts, trapped in a cycle of resentment and unspoken regrets. He reaches for his wallet on the counter and flips it open. Inside, there's a picture of his daughter from years ago, smiling in her cheerleading uniform. Her smile is the same as it was when she left for college. But now, that smile feels like a reminder of everything that's been lost. A reminder of a time before the world started changing. Gerald's fingers hover over the photo, but he slams the wallet shut with a force that rattles the kitchen counter. It's almost as though he's trying to silence the ache that's gnawing at him. In the past few years, Gerald's life has been a downward spiral, losing his wife to cancer, dealing with his daughter leaving for college, and now, this new presence in the neighborhood that stirs something in him. He's angry, but he doesn't know why. He's never confronted anything like this before. He takes a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his thoughts race again. The new neighbor, Elijah. What kind of man is he? Gerald knows what he's seen. The man is tall, confident, self-assured, and, most notably, different. Elijah's presence alone unsettles him. And then there's the subtle way he carries himself, as if he's earned the right to be there. Gerald's chest tightens as he recalls how Elijah had looked at him when they first made eye contact, the boldness in his eyes that made Gerald feel small. It wasn't arrogance, but there was something in it that felt like a challenge. According to Elijah's perspective, we see a very different set of circumstances. Elijah, a man in his early 30s, stands in front of the mirror, buttoning up his shirt for the day. His face is composed, but there's a certain tension in his eyes. This neighborhood, this house, is supposed to be a fresh start for him. After years of moving from one place to another, trying to escape the poverty-stricken areas of his youth, he's finally found a place where he can put down roots, where he can be someone other than just the guy from the other side of town. But it's not as simple as he thought. As he looks at himself in the mirror, Elijah is reminded of the weight he carries, being one of the few black faces in a predominantly white neighborhood. The tension in the air is thick, almost suffocating, but he's determined to make it work. His dreams of a peaceful life, away from the crime and the stereotypes of his past, are within his reach. He's worked hard for this house, this space. Every hour spent working long shifts at the factory, every penny saved, every sacrifice made. Elijah lets out a long, steadying breath before heading to the kitchen. He pours himself a cup of coffee, the smell of it filling the otherwise sterile air of his new home. The kitchen is stark, the walls still bare from the move, and the emptiness of the space matches the emptiness he feels inside. He's come far, but the journey isn't over. He's not naive. He knows that this neighborhood isn't going to accept him with open arms. As he sips his coffee, Elijah's thoughts turn to the people in the neighborhood, the ones who have already made it clear they're curious, but distant. And then there's the man across the street, Gerald. He's seen the way Gerald looks at him, those fleeting glances that quickly turn away. There's something about him that makes Elijah uneasy. It's not just the look. It's the way Gerald's eyes linger for a moment too long, the quiet judgment that rests in his gaze. Elijah remembers his first interaction with Gerald, the brief exchange when he introduced himself, a handshake that felt too stiff, too forced. Gerald had said something about the weather, then quickly retreated back into his house. Elijah had tried to offer a warm smile, but it had been met with a cold indifference. It wasn't what Elijah had hoped for, but he expected it. What he didn't expect was how much it bothered him. He had wanted to believe that things would be different here, that he could find peace in this neighborhood. But Gerald's reaction gnaws at him. Elijah can't shake the feeling that Gerald sees him as an outsider, someone who doesn't belong. As the day progresses, the audience gets a glimpse into Elijah's past, flashes of his youth spent in an inner-city neighborhood. He was raised by his single mother, who struggled to make ends meet. He remembers the days when the police would come by for no reason, the times when he and his friends would be watched more closely than the other kids. But Elijah never let that define him. Instead, he focused on his studies, on sports, on doing whatever he could to escape the cycle of poverty that defined his neighborhood. But it wasn't always easy. He had faced so many obstacles, being told he wasn't good enough, being stereotyped based on the color of his skin, being left out of opportunities because people just assumed he wasn't capable. But Elijah fought back, each rejection fueling his drive. He worked harder than anyone else to prove that he could make it. He found his way into college on a sports scholarship, eventually making his mark as one of the top athletes in the country. And now, here he is, living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, still haunted by his past but hopeful for the future. But there's a secret that Elijah has yet to share with anyone, a secret that ties his fate to Gerald in a way neither of them could ever imagine. On the other side, we learn more about Gerald's past. Raised in this very neighborhood, Gerald grew up in a world of strict traditions, old-world values, and expectations that were hard to shake. His father had been a prominent figure in the community, someone whose reputation was solidified by years of hard work and dedication. But beneath that success was a man who didn't always live by the values he preached, a man who held on to deep-seated prejudices that he passed down to his son. Gerald had always followed his father's lead, believing in the old ideas of hierarchy and privilege. But the death of his wife had rocked his world, leaving him struggling with his own identity. His daughter's departure only made him feel more alone. And now, the arrival of a black man next door has stirred something within him that he doesn't fully understand. He's never questioned the biases that have been a part of him for so long. What neither man knows is that their paths have crossed before, years ago, in a moment that would forever alter the course of their lives. Elijah had saved Gerald's life once, in an unexpected twist of fate. But neither of them remembers the encounter, and the truth of it is buried in the past. The camera cuts away, hinting at the mysterious connection without revealing too much, leaving the audience hanging on the edge of their seats. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the suburban street, the tension between Elijah and Gerald became palpable. It wasn't just the physical distance between them, but the invisible walls built over years of suspicion and prejudice. Elijah, having moved into the neighborhood just a few months ago, was still an outsider, despite his best efforts to fit in. Gerald, a longtime resident with deep roots in the community, had always prided himself on his traditional views. His home, nestled on the corner of a quiet cul-de-sac, was his sanctuary, everything in its place, just the way he liked it. But Elijah's arrival stirred something in him, something he couldn't name but instinctively resented. It wasn't just Elijah's race that irked Gerald. It was the audacity of his presence, as though a man like Elijah, who had clearly grown up in a different world, had no business being in a neighborhood like this one, a place that Gerald had fought so hard to protect from any form of disruption. And so, each time they passed by each other, the air grew heavier, charged with unspoken words and unresolved tension. Elijah tried to be courteous, to wave when he saw Gerald mowing the lawn or tinkering in the garage. But Gerald's nods were curt, his gaze barely meeting Elijah's, as if acknowledging him was a burden. The next incident that would escalate the tension occurred on a warm Saturday afternoon. Elijah had just finished carrying some boxes into his house when Gerald's truck pulled into his driveway. He was puzzled. Gerald had never once come over to introduce himself properly, Yet now he was here, and there was something menacing in his eyes. "Hey, Elijah," Gerald called, stepping out of his truck and walking over with deliberate, slow steps. His tone was polite but strained, like he was trying to hold back something darker. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Elijah, cautious but still hopeful for a conversation, wiped his hands on his jeans. He had come to expect the cold shoulders, but he never stopped trying to bridge the gap. "Of course, Gerald. What's up?" Gerald stopped just short of Elijah's front porch. He crossed his arms, his posture defensive, but his voice was steady. "Listen, I've been thinking," he began, eyes narrowing slightly as he looked Elijah up and down. "You're living here now, in a nice neighborhood. You've got to understand something. People around here, they don't take kindly to certain things, all right? It's not about you as a person. Well, it kind of is, but that's not the point." Elijah was taken aback, unsure of where this conversation was heading. He knew Gerald had never been the friendliest neighbor, but he didn't expect this kind of confrontation so suddenly. "What do you mean, Gerald?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm, his composure steady. "I mean," Gerald paused, seemingly gathering his thoughts, "this neighborhood isn't just a place for anyone to come in and set up shop. I've heard things about you, Elijah, and frankly, I don't think you're the kind of guy who belongs here. Maybe you should just go back to where you came from." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. They weren't overtly threatening, but the implication hung in the air like a cloud of smoke. Gerald had no idea that the very thing he was accusing Elijah of, being in the wrong place, was something Elijah had already spent years proving wrong. The thing about Elijah wasn't just that he was a man of color. It was that he had fought tooth and nail for his place in this world. His whole life had been a battle against assumptions, against being told he didn't belong. He had built himself up from nothing, working long hours, fighting through prejudices and barriers that Gerald couldn't even imagine. But now, in this moment, standing on his own porch, Elijah felt every ounce of that fight come crashing down upon him. "You don't even know me, Gerald," Elijah said, his voice low but firm. "You don't know where I've been or what I've been through. And you have no right to tell me I don't belong here." For a moment, the air between them was thick with silence. Gerald's lips pressed into a thin line, and for the first time, Elijah saw a flicker of doubt in his neighbor's eyes. Gerald shifted his weight, his arms uncrossed, and he took a step back, as though he realized he might have overstepped. "You're right. I don't know you," Gerald muttered, his voice losing some of its edge. "But I'm just saying, this isn't the place for someone like you. People are talking. I don't want you to make things harder on yourself." Elijah stood tall, refusing to back down. "I've worked hard for everything I have. I deserve to be here just as much as anyone else." Gerald, now visibly uncomfortable, turned away, muttering something about keeping the peace, before walking back to his truck. The conversation was over, but the seed of animosity had been planted deeper than before. As the days passed, Elijah began to notice the subtle shifts in the neighborhood. The neighbors who had once waved at him as they drove by now turned their heads. The friendly conversations at the mailbox grew stilted and short. It wasn't just Gerald anymore. There was a coldness in the air, something that crept into every corner of the neighborhood. Whispers behind closed doors, glances that were just a little too long, all fueled by the thinly veiled racism that had only just begun to rear its ugly head. But Elijah wasn't the type to retreat. He refused to be pushed out of a place he had worked so hard to claim. The rising tension between him and Gerald was just the beginning. He knew that. But what Elijah didn't know was that the darkness between them would soon give way to a shocking revelation. One that would turn everything they both believed about each other upside down. The day the storm broke came unexpectedly. Elijah had been bracing himself for the worst, but nothing could have prepared him for what he would discover about Gerald. He had heard the whispers, the murmurs behind his back, but he hadn't expected the animosity to reach a boiling point so quickly. The neighborhood, once serene, now felt suffocating. Even the leaves in the trees seemed to quiver in the tense air. It all started with a knock on his door. It was early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. Elijah had just gotten out of bed, groggy from a long night of work. He wasn't expecting company, especially not after the last conversation with Gerald. But when he opened the door, his heart dropped into his stomach. Standing there was a local police officer, his uniform crisp and clean, a frown etched on his face. "Mr. Williams?" the officer asked, his voice firm. Elijah nodded, a sinking feeling filling his chest. He had no idea what this was about. "We've received a complaint from your neighbor, Mr. Gerald Atkinson. He claims you've been disturbing the peace. He says you've been playing loud music late at night and causing a scene." The officer's eyes were unreadable, but there was an air of disbelief in his voice. Elijah could see it now. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was more. Much more. "I haven't been causing any problems," Elijah said, his voice even, though his heart was racing. "I've been inside, working on my project." "I don't know why he's saying that." The officer nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. "I'll need to take a statement, Mr. Williams. If there's any truth to this, we might have to take further action." The officer's tone didn't soften. Elijah felt the weight of the accusation settle like a heavy stone in his chest. Before Elijah could respond, the officer turned and walked back to his squad car, leaving Elijah standing there, unsure of what to do. He hadn't played loud music. He hadn't caused a scene. But Gerald's words hung in the air, and they were enough to plant the seed of doubt in the officer's mind. Was this how it was going to be? Was he going to be treated as a problem in a neighborhood he had worked so hard to be part of? He slammed the door behind him and leaned against it, trying to steady his breath. This couldn't be happening. But just as quickly as the panic rose, something else surfaced, something even more unsettling. Gerald had been watching him. He had been waiting for the smallest misstep, the smallest excuse to turn the neighborhood against him. It was all part of his plan. Elijah didn't wait. He grabbed his phone and dialed the number of a friend from his past, a friend who had been there when things weren't easy, someone who knew the truth about what had happened years ago. As the phone rang, his thoughts raced. He had to get the truth out. The truth would clear his name, and Gerald would finally understand that there was more to Elijah than he thought. The phone clicked, and a familiar voice answered, groggy but alert. "Hello? Chris," Elijah said, his voice urgent. "I need your help. You won't believe what's happening, but it's all connected to something we went through. You remember that night? That night at the old warehouse?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. Chris' voice was suddenly sharp with recognition. "You're talking about the fire?" Elijah took a deep breath. "Yeah. Gerald doesn't know, but he's the one who's been accusing me of causing trouble. He doesn't know that years ago, I saved his life. He doesn't know that if it weren't for me, he wouldn't be here." Chris' voice dropped to a whisper, as though he could feel the weight of the story coming to light. "What are you talking about, Elijah?" Elijah ran his fingers through his hair, staring out the window at the quiet suburban street, now a battleground in his eyes. "That fire, Chris. Gerald was the one trapped in that burning warehouse. I was the one who ran in, pulled him out. I was the one who risked my life to save him. And now, he's accusing me of things I didn't do." There was another pause, a beat of silence before Chris spoke again, his voice steady but filled with disbelief. "You saved his life? And he doesn't even know? He doesn't remember?" Elijah shook his head, though Chris couldn't see him. "He doesn't remember. He doesn't want to remember. And I'm starting to think that's the real reason he's doing this, because he feels like he owes me something. Maybe he feels ashamed." Chris let out a long sigh. "You have to tell him, Elijah. He needs to know. But don't let him drag you down into that mess. You've come too far to let him get away with this." As Elijah hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of determination. This wasn't just about the petty squabbles of neighborhood politics anymore. This was about something deeper, about a man who was clinging to a false narrative, to a lie, because facing the truth was too difficult. And so, Elijah made a decision. He would confront Gerald, not with anger or bitterness, but with the truth. It was time to expose what had really happened, to finally break the silence. But he knew that doing so would change everything. The story he was about to tell wasn't just going to clear his name. It would reveal the deep-seated fears and insecurities that had led Gerald to make his accusations. It would force both of them to face the past and each other, in a way they never had before. Elijah's decision to confront Gerald wasn't an easy one, But the truth had to be told. It was no longer just about clearing his name or defending his reputation. This was bigger than that. It was about dismantling the walls of pride and guilt that had kept both men from facing the truth, from understanding each other on a deeper level. He stood in front of Gerald's house later that evening, his heart pounding. It wasn't the same kind of fear that had once gripped him when he'd been in the heat of that warehouse fire, rescuing a man who now stood as his accuser. No, this fear was different. This was a fear of the unknown. How would Gerald react? Would he finally admit that Elijah had saved him all those years ago? Or would he continue to live in denial, clinging to the lie? With a deep breath, Elijah rang the doorbell. The sound echoed into the quiet evening, almost louder than the thumping of his own heartbeat. Gerald answered the door, his face tense as always, eyes narrowing when he saw Elijah standing there, a determined look on his face. "What do you want?" Gerald's voice was low and defensive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "I need to talk to you," Elijah said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying urgency. "It's about that night. The fire." Gerald's face shifted, a flicker of confusion crossing his features. He glanced over his shoulder, as though weighing the consequences of letting this conversation unfold. "I don't know what you're talking about. We're not friends. You don't get to just show up here and start talking about that." Elijah stood his ground. "You don't get it, do you? You don't remember, but I remember. I remember the smoke, the heat, the way the flames seemed to close in on us. I remember pulling you out of there when you couldn't move. You would have died if it weren't for me." Gerald flinched, but he didn't speak. There was a long pause between them. Elijah could see the turmoil in Gerald's eyes, the battle between shame and pride, between the weight of the truth and the comfort of the lie. It was clear that he was trying to suppress a flood of emotions that had been buried for years. "Why didn't you ever thank me, Gerald? Why have you been treating me like I'm the enemy all this time?" Elijah's voice cracked, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I saved your life, and now you're accusing me of things I didn't do. What's the point of all this?" Gerald's eyes darted to the ground, his lips trembling. It was as if the floodgates were about to open, but he still couldn't bring himself to speak the words. "I don't know how to deal with it, Elijah," Gerald finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been carrying this guilt for years. The fact that you saved me, and I never did anything to repay you. I didn't know how to handle it, so I buried it, pretended it didn't happen. And now, I've been accusing you of things to cover up the shame I feel." Elijah's heart softened as he watched the layers of Gerald's facade begin to crumble. It wasn't an easy admission, but it was a powerful one. For the first time, Gerald was being vulnerable, confronting the guilt that had haunted him for so long. "I didn't want to feel indebted to you," Gerald continued, his eyes brimming with emotion. "I couldn't face it. I couldn't face the fact that I owe you my life. So, I did everything I could to push you away. I treated you like you were the problem, when all along, I was the one who couldn't accept that you saved me." Elijah took a slow step forward, his voice quieter now, more understanding. "It's not about being indebted, Gerald. I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because it was the right thing to do. You didn't owe me anything." There was a silence between them, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Elijah could see the conflict in Gerald's face, but also something else, relief. The truth was out now, and it was raw. It wasn't going to be easy to move past, but it was the first step toward healing. "I'm sorry," Gerald finally said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been a fool. I was so scared of facing the truth that I hurt you in the process. I've been a coward." Elijah's eyes softened, and he gave a slight nod. "It's not too late to make it right, but it's going to take time. I don't expect everything to be fixed overnight, but we have to start somewhere." The tension between them was still there, but it had shifted. The accusations, the bitterness, they were being replaced with something more honest, more human. And while it was going to take time for their relationship to heal, this was a step in the right direction. Gerald took a deep breath, as though a weight had been lifted from his chest. "Thank you for coming here today. I know I've got a lot to make up for." "You don't need to thank me," Elijah replied. "You just need to be a better neighbor. And maybe, just maybe, we can move forward." Gerald nodded, the first genuine smile breaking through his guarded expression. "Yeah, I think we can." As Elijah turned to walk away, he felt a sense of closure wash over him. The tension was far from over, and the road ahead would be long. But this moment, this conversation, had cracked the foundation of something broken, and that, in itself, was a victory. The next few weeks passed with a cautious optimism. Gerald made an effort to reach out, to apologize to Elijah in small ways, helping with yard work, offering small gestures of kindness. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, and that was enough. For Elijah, this wasn't just about the neighborhood or the past. It was about moving forward. It was about realizing that even the deepest wounds could be healed with truth, empathy, and time. He had always known that the past didn't define him, but now, he understood something more important. The future was in his hands, and he could choose to make it better. As the days passed, the silence between Elijah and Gerald began to fade. The uneasy distance that had once defined their interactions gave way to something more human, something raw, but healing. For Elijah, it wasn't about seeking revenge or retribution. It had never been. From the moment he had pulled Gerald from the flames years ago, he had hoped, even if just a little, that they would one day see each other as equals. That his act of courage would lead to understanding, not resentment. But life had been complicated, hadn't it? They had both carried burdens, Gerald, the guilt of being saved but never truly acknowledging the man who had saved him, and Elijah, the resentment of being erased from the narrative of his own heroic actions. The shame that had festered within them both was slowly unraveling, piece by piece. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was happening. Gerald's efforts to make amends had been quiet at first, small gestures. A wave across the yard, an offer to help with a heavy package Elijah had been struggling with, an unexpected phone call asking about how he was doing. They were awkward moments, filled with the weight of history, but also imbued with something Elijah hadn't expected: sincerity. Elijah, for his part, kept his distance at first. He was cautious, knowing that just because Gerald had apologized didn't mean the pain had disappeared. Trust, once broken, could be fragile. But there was something about Gerald's willingness to try that touched him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The man who had once threatened him was now a man attempting to rebuild the fragile bridge between them. It wasn't perfect. It didn't happen overnight. There were still tense moments when Elijah would catch Gerald looking at him, as though trying to understand how to fix everything that had gone wrong. Gerald still struggled with the weight of his pride and guilt, but the difference now was that he was actively trying to carry it, rather than bury it. And that meant something. One evening, as Elijah was walking home from work, he saw Gerald sitting on his porch, looking out over the street. He had a beer in his hand, but it was the way he sat there, quiet, contemplative, that made Elijah stop. The cold evening air seemed to match the stillness in the man's posture. He was thinking, reflecting, perhaps regretting. But there was something else there now, peace, or at least a willingness to seek it. "Hey," Elijah called out, his voice breaking through the silence of the night. Gerald turned to look at him, offering a tentative smile. "Hey, Elijah, how's it going?" Elijah shrugged but smiled back. Same old, same old. Just finished up a long day. Thought I'd take a walk." Gerald nodded, motioning for Elijah to join him on the porch. "You want a drink?" Elijah hesitated, then nodded, sitting down beside him. The beer wasn't what mattered. It was the quiet moment between them that did. A moment that held a significance neither of them could ignore. "You know," Gerald began after a pause, his voice a little more thoughtful than before, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about how I treated you all these years. And I don't have an excuse for it. I don't think I ever will. But I want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." Elijah looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in Gerald's eyes. This wasn't the same man who had once accused him without cause. This was a man facing the fallout of his actions and choosing to own them. "I can see that," Elijah said quietly. "And it means something." There was a long pause. The air between them was filled with unspoken understanding. They didn't need to hash out every detail. What mattered now was that they were sitting there, together, as two men who had been through something difficult, but who were both willing to find a way forward. "It's going to take time," Gerald added after a while, his voice tinged with regret. But I hope you know I'm not going to give up on trying to make it right. I don't want to live in that darkness anymore. Elijah nodded. I get it. It's not easy, but I think you're on the right track. They sat in silence again, the kind of silence that spoke volumes. The world around them felt quieter in that moment, less about the mistakes of the past and more about the possibility of the future. They had both suffered, but they had also survived. And in that survival was the hope for something better. As the weeks turned into months, the dynamic between them continued to shift. It wasn't always perfect, and there were moments of tension, moments when old wounds felt fresh again. But those moments were fewer and further between. Elijah and Gerald had begun to redefine their relationship. They had created a space where honesty could exist, where apologies could be offered and accepted, and where growth was possible. One afternoon, as they worked together to fix a broken fence that separated their properties, Gerald turned to Elijah with a small but genuine smile. You ever think about what happened all those years ago? Gerald asked, his voice tinged with a certain nostalgia. Sometimes, Elijah replied, wiping sweat from his brow. But mostly, I think about how far we've come since then. Gerald nodded, and for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt a sense of peace settle within him. The scars of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him, nor did they define Gerald. What defined them now was the work they had put into understanding each other, the efforts they had made to confront their pasts and find a path forward. And as the sun set behind them, casting long shadows over the yard, Elijah realized something that had eluded him for so long. The act of saving someone's life wasn't just about the physical act. It was about the long journey that followed, about choosing to confront the past, face the truth, and heal, even when it seemed impossible. It was about understanding that sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or fire, but with words, with empathy, and with the courage to make things right.